And I'm going to pin myself just for a moment. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm going to start us off today, and I think there are people who are still coming into the room, but I think it's best to get started. Most of you will know me, but for those of you who don't, I'm Jay Garcia. I teach in the Department of Comparative Literature at NYU. It's my pleasure to serve as host today. This is the first of several terrific events compiled and organized for spring 2021. Let me say here that today's event and really all of the events are being arranged and set in motion by Michael Ernst, who is in the room with us. So big thanks to Michael. You'll see that the event is being recorded. We're going to keep this up on the Compilate website for a couple of weeks. So that's why you see that on your screen. The plan for today is to have our guest speak to us for some time about his recent book. I'll then offer up some questions to begin the conversation portion of the event. And from there, I hope to have quite a bit of time for questions from all of you. I'll ask you to stay muted until the Q&A period. Okay, I'm very happy to say that our speaker today is Daniel Elam, who is assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Hong Kong. In 2018-2019, he was a fellow in the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University. And in 2015-2016, Daniel was Mellon Sawyer Seminar Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in Bibliomigrancy, which I'll be curious to hear more about, perhaps. He has studied in the past at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and at Northwestern University. Daniel works across a range of subjects and areas, including the work of anti-colonial revolutionaries in the 19 teens and 20s, anti-racist thinkers of the 30s and 40s, Third World Solidarity of the 50s and 60s, and the anti-apartheid movements of the 1970s, and as well, AIDS activism of the 80s and 90s. Among his publications are The Archpriestess of Anarchy, Visits Lahore, Violence, Love, and the Worldliness of Revolutionary Texts in Post-Colonial Studies, and Take Your Geography and Trace It, The Cosmopolitan Aesthetics of W.E.B. Du Bois and Don Gopal Mukherjee in Interventions. And there are a number of other publications that I'll not have time to mention, but I direct you to Post 45, Boundary 2, and the LA Review of Books. In the chat, I've listed Daniel's webpage, which has all of those publications listed. On the horizon, among other things, is a reader in Empire, Modernity, and Critique, covering 20th century global thought in the Global South, which seeks to provide a new picture of the global circulation of philosophical, aesthetic, and political thought in the 20th century. Look for that from Bloomsbury in 2022. But today we are here to discuss Daniel's new book, recently published by Fordham University Press, World Literature for the Wretched of the Earth, Anti-Colonial Aesthetics, Post-Colonial Politics. The book concentrates on theories of reading and critique in the writings of Lala Har Dayal, B.R. Ambedkar, M.K. Gandhi, and Bhagat Singh. It is also, as those of you who have had a chance to read the introduction will know, a book that invites us to think in new ways about histories of comparative literature and anti-colonial thought, and to think these histories together. The book is an original exploration of Har Dayal, Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Singh that seeks to work at some remove from what Daniel Elam calls the work of hagiographers of Indian anti-colonialism. He directs our attention to the experiments of minor anti-colonial practice that in different ways help to activate a radically anti-authoritarian political philosophy. So that we can learn more about those experiments and that philosophy, please join me in welcoming Daniel Elam.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Michael, for putting everything together and all the details. And thank you, everyone, for showing up on what I assume for most people is a Thursday afternoon. I'm coming in from Basel, so it's a nice Thursday evening. What I'll do is kind of briefly talk about kind of the goals as I now see them now that the book is finished of the book. I don't know if I would have been able to articulate them in the writing process, but I thought I might read them out here a little bit, give a brief overview of the book, and then hopefully kind of open up to Q&A with Jay, and then also answer questions and discuss the book with you. So those of you who have read some of the book will know that world literature for the Wretched of the Earth attempts to do many things at the same time. Here is a short list. One, to situate anti-colonial thought under the rubrics of critique, and therefore as a literary and political project. Two, to suggest a shared genealogy of philological and anti-colonial thought across the 20th century to show that some sort of shared interest in theorizing a world after colonialism and after fascism, and a literature of some variety that would be suitable for that world. Three, to show how comparative literature and anti-colonial thought have more often than not foregrounded the perpetual insufficiency and impossibility of their demands. And it's on the basis of this impossibility that the projects of comparative literature, comparative philology, and anti-colonialism become urgent and necessary. Today is also happens to be the publication date of this book in South Asia, and the South Asian title is Impossible and Necessary. To get a different spin on the same thought. Four, to trace how under the name of reading or reading together, anti-colonial thought and philology disavowed mastery and expertise in favor of anti-authoritarianism and egalitarian practices that, to use Michel de Certeau's words, leave no traces. Five, to draw out a central and unanswerable question that I think runs through most pessimistic utopianism. How do we act on the behalf of a world that we want to exist, but whose existence, if it were to ever occur, will happen long after we are dead? So yes, five completely unfraught, easy to straightforward questions, all in under 200 pages. I won't pretend to have answered any of them fully, but I also, I think, won't be coy for the first time and rely on the defense of my own critical unknowing and inexpertise. When people have asked what the book is about, my reply has been some version of, I look forward to you telling me. It's not insincere, but apparently it has annoyed my partner, who has since put a moratorium on that response. So this is also a chance for me to move beyond that coy response. So, I mean, all of the five questions above, to my mind, are indelibly tied to one another. And I think, I mean, Jay and I were just talking about this, also all present in Gauri Gill's beautiful photograph that is on the cover that I'm incredibly lucky to have on the cover of the book. To practice critique is to rethink the world's aesthetic and political contours, and to do so, at least as I see it, with Walter Benjamin's particular combination of awe, deference, unsureness, and urgency. I was also frustrated by, as Jay mentioned, the post-colonial hagiography that played radical anti-colonial thought backwards from national independence, as though it was always assumed of its own success and the specificity of that success. This is bad history, but it also inspires bad politics and bad humanistic inquiry. Future success and future mastery become the only measures for activism and critique in the present. The only people who have claimed to be experts on the future are fascists, who have a clear vision of its purity, or colonizers, who have a clear vision of its hierarchies. And there's little reason to want to replicate these logics. At the same time, nevertheless, I think it's imperative that we act on behalf of some sort of world after colonialism, which is anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-casteist, rather than wallowing in the insufficiency of our actions in the present. As I'm seeing people come into the chat, I'm grateful to a number of people who are here for kind of helping me think in the early stages of this, early and middle and late stages of this book. And I'll continue to mention a few throughout. But Gloria Fisk and Candace Chur and Michael Allen have all written about the supposed values to be accrued and the authorizing functions of world literary reading within educational institutions. And Janice Radway and Joan Shelley Rubin have written about the allures of economic success that middlebrow world literary reading practices ostensibly promise. These writers have reminded us in very different ways, is not an inherently virtuous exercise. nor is it a neutral practice. The question I am asking in the book then is what an anti-colonial theory of reading might look like, such that anti-colonialism is rendered truly synonymous with anti-authoritarianism. So the book is not about the reading habits of anti-colonial activists, though I am keen to read that book if anyone would like to write it for me, please. We know that Ambedkar read John Dewey and Gandhi read Ralph Waldo Emerson, but that does not make Ambedkar a pragmatist or Gandhi a transcendentalist. We also know that plenty of white people read How to Be an Anti-Racist last year. There are no actual readers in world literature for The Wretched of the Earth. There are only theories and tentative proposals for how to read in ways that would strive towards irrelevance or reach towards others or for others to read alongside, to read with. Bhagat Singh, for example, demands better books to be delivered to his jail cell 2 weeks before he is hanged. And Eric Auerbach's critic only has starting points for her reading assignments. And often they're wrong. Reading is fundamental, but more importantly, reading is completely inconsequential. To think reading as inconsequential rather than as transformative is to commit to a radical politics of the meantime, of impatience, and of staging an ephemeral post-colonial utopia among friends in the present, these friends who will not likely live to see a post-colonial utopia at the scale of the world. So bracketed then by, if you have guessed from the title, on one hand, Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth and Eric Auerbach's World Literature, the book chapters in between freeze-frame South Asian anti-colonial thought between 1919 and 1939. To my mind, this 20-year stretch was a time when it was possible to theorize and demand a post-colonial political community, but without any reason to believe that those anti-colonial demands would actually be met. Fanon, of course, was hardly convinced that the end of French colonial rule would mean the end of colonialism, and Auerbach's philological projects in the 1950s and 1960s still carried quite heavily the fear of a violently homogenizing world. For the four figures of the chapters, I chose four great men of South Asian anti-colonial history, Lala Hardayal, B.R. Ambedkar, M.K. Gandhi, and Bhagat Singh. Lala Hardayal was the founder of the Punjab and California-based Ghadar Party, and which attempted a mutiny against the British Raj in 1914. Bhagat Singh co-founded the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, which advocated for perpetual revolution in Inqilab Zindabad until he was hanged at age 23. B.R. Ambedkar drafted the Indian Constitution and remains a central figure in anti-caste politics. And M.K. Gandhi advocated nonviolence and remains probably the most prominent face of Indian anti-colonialism, for better or for worse. Ambedkar and Bhagat Singh were two of Gandhi's fiercest adversaries, and Ambedkar especially, I think, challenged Gandhi in ways that Gandhi wasn't expected to be challenged. And Lala Hardayal, though he is less well known now or outside of Punjab, was considered to be one of the most threatening figures to the British Raj until his turn to religious and ethical studies in the 1920s. So if you haven't read the full book, here's a much condensed overview. Each of the chapters traces how these anti-colonial thinkers simultaneously advocated against the British Raj by throwing bombs, by making demands, and quite openly advocating for independence or some form of anti-colonialism, and also attempted to figure out how to take care of friends, comrades, and colleagues whose lives would almost certainly end before the British Raj would. For Lala Hardayal, this involved imagining in the wake of an armed mutiny and alongside George Orwell, a world state of friendship and of obligations to others. The chapter on B.R. Ambedkar demonstrates how Ambedkar's use of early 20th century sociological theory, with its lingering commitments to vitalism, Henri Bergson, and William James, sought to render the liberal subject and therefore caste as totally impossible. In the chapter on Gandhi, I traced backwards Gandhi's insistence on losing debates from a failed fast in 1939 to his most famous, though imagined, debate in Swaraj in 1909. What I wanted to do there, and we can talk about this chapter a bit more, is it's to show how kind of Gandhi's orientation towards loss aligns him more with the reader of that staged debate than the editor, as he's usually assumed to be. In the chapter on Bhagat Singh, I take his jail notebook as proof not of eventual mastery had he not been hanged, which is the kind of way that most post-colonial hagiographers have tended to argue. Had Bhagat Singh lived, he would have written 4 volumes on world socialism, the jail notebook is proof of that. But in direct contrast to that, I argue that it's precisely that it's an incomplete, irrelevant document of unknowing that is why it's important for our analysis. And then in lieu of a conclusion, I return to Fanon and Baker and Auerbach, all of whom reached their conclusion before colonialism reached its. What does colonial, and the question there then becomes, what does colonialism look like at the conclusion, in the final instance, on a deathbed in Bethesda, bedridden and nearly blind in Delhi, or trying to figure out how one ends a project quite as monumental as mimesis. In an email, Jay reminded me that all four men, or at least as I have staged them in the book, are connected to the US and to US leftist activism in the early 20th century. This was much more prominent in earlier drafts than in the book, but I think it's still worth thinking about. Lala Hardayal was based in San Francisco and worked closely with anarchists along the North American West Coast. Bia and Bedker was John Dewey's PhD student at Columbia University. Gandhi quoted Emerson and Thoreau when he was stuck in a particularly Gandhian mess. His favorite line was, "Consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds." And I also credit, the way I opened the chapter is to credit a 19-year-old undergraduate at UNC Chapel Hill in 1942 as providing the best philosophical analysis of Gandhi to date, despite the brilliance of many, many others. Bhagat Singh's definition of anarchism was taken verbatim from Emma Goldman, and his favorite movie was a 1927 adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we can, and I'm happy to talk about this as well, which he understood to be a call for anti-racist revolution. The US is also where Fanon, against his wishes, finished The Wretched of the Earth shortly before his death. And the US is the home, or at least became the home, of comparative literature after World War II. It was not that the US was a land of liberty, equality, and fraternity. On the contrary, it was precisely that it wasn't. But so desperately wanted to be, even as it continued to enact horrific violence against the people it alleged to be its citizens. And it was this kind of disjuncture that made, I think, the US an interesting and compelling case study for anti-colonial thinkers outside of it. There are many other reasons why I chose these four men, but what they have in common, besides a surprising number of unfinished reading lists written for friends, is that they have become, well, the great men of South Asian anti-colonial history. Because they represent the bold, daring, masculinist actions of properly political activism, it seemed all the more necessary, for me at least, to recuperate their smaller, more minor visions, namely their simultaneous desire for inconsequence. So at the same time that they have been rendered consequential actors in South Asian history, I think that there's a reason to believe that all four of them were theorizing their own irrelevance. Two of these men lived to see India's independence from the British Raj, but none of them lived to see the post-colonial world they had imagined, and none of them expected to. It is perhaps true that none of these thinkers wrote literature, however it might be defined, but I strongly believe that all four figures theorized what literature is, what it could be for a world after colonialism. Anti-colonialism then is not a dully pragmatic or paint-by-numbers project, but a rethinking of every aspect of the world, from politics to the aesthetics. And in a sense, it is fully in line with what Benjamin believed was the task of the philologist and not the philosopher, and certainly in line with Adorno's much later essay on commitment. All four thinkers theorized anti-colonialism as a practice or orientation rather than as an identity. I think this stands in direct contrast to nationalism, whose history since the age of German Romanticism has tethered itself to national literary canons, and in contrast, world literature, with its authors and authorial figures scattered hierarchically throughout the rest of the world. Anti-colonialism, as anti-authoritarian reading, becomes an attempt to demand a different world and to imagine a literature that world might contain or produce. In contemporary South Asia, this book reads as a much more stronger condemnation of nationalism and the xenophobic nationalist co-optation of anti-colonial pasts than it does in the North Atlantic world. I'm grateful to Prathama Banerjee for drawing my attention to how much this book is steeped in the specificities of Modi-era Delhi politics. And I'm grateful for my friends in Delhi who are to blame for this. Nevertheless, I think the book is wrestling with concerns that are much smaller or perhaps much larger than the imaginative scale of nationalism. So framed differently, the book is an attempt to triangulate the three most catalyzing concerns of the 20th century, and likely, or at least I hope, the 21st. From Fanon, the pessimistic utopianism of radical Black thought, indebted not only to Fanon, but to Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, Aimé Césaire, and others. From South Asia, the beginnings of an anti-colonialism that would lead to the decolonial wave from the 1940s to the 1970s, and the dismal bifurcated Cold War world in which post-independent nations were forced to emerge. And from Auerbach, the horrific 20th century mutations of what Karl Marx and Bruno Bauer had dubbed die Judenfrage almost a century earlier. So framed otherwise, and here I'm indebted to Shruti Kapila for her clarity on this, the book begins to triangulate, to my mind, the three of the most important, most influential, and most world-changing trajectories of thought since 1900. Black radical thought, decoloniality, and the Jewish question, and afterwards, the ethics of a Jewish damaged life. To be clear, we still live in a colonial world and at a moment of widespread fascism. And this horrific world will almost surely outlive us all. But we have also inherited ways of demanding that that world be otherwise, and in the meantime, fleeting and minor ways of survival. How do we triangulate this? This is where I am now, having written the book and sat with it for a few years. Before it came out, how do we triangulate or retriangulate the political philosophies of fugitivity, utopianism, and minimum moralia for the 21st century? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Daniel. And I think there are going to be lots of questions. Thank you for the overview of the book. I'm gonna start off with some questions for Daniel, but then I'm going to very quickly invite others to come in. So please have your questions ready, or you can also put them in the chat, and I'll review them there. I know several of you actually had a chance to read Daniel's introduction, but for those of you who have not, I thought, Daniel, I would just give you a chance to say a bit more about some of the formulations that show up there, which I think you've already touched on in a way, but that could help people tune in even more to some of the kind of major concerns that that are in the book. One is this sort of definition that you give to reading. One of them, at least, is sort of the critical practice of unknowability and unknowing. And in a way, you've already touched on this, but I wonder if you could say more about that formulation.
Yes, I mean, I was really drawn to a line in Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, which is a very kind of a relatively opaque line, which is that every generation must discover its mission in relative opacity, either to fulfill it, or betray it. And then also, every time you teach Wretched of the Earth, you're confronted with such, bravado introduction, preface, celebrity preface. And to me, this kind of thinking, Fanon's thinking of relative opacity as a way of heralding comrades, while also not knowing who those comrades might be. It's an open invitation, which is a risk. Something like Anika Jarare has more recently theorized that in terms of caste. It's also then a kind of way of thinking about unknowability. In other words, how do you remain fairly opaque to your colonizer, even though he's eavesdropping? And finally, it's a document of unknowing. I mean, Fanon does not. The Wretched of the Earth is not particularly optimistic about the world to come. But it's kind of the thing that it's most sure about is that it doesn't know what that world will be. And so to me, the three interlocking unknowing, unknowability, and the unknown, I think a structure of a form of anti-colonial practice that then maps along other strains of anti-colonialism.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And then there's also there's also a line in your introduction where you where you say that it's actually the pleasures of critique you want to some extent, focus on, or at least give some kind of room for. And maybe you could say more about that piece of it too.
Yes, so I think I think a lot of maybe it's the kind of influence of Gandhi over South Asian anti-colonial thought, or the kind of privileging of some sort of masculinist asceticism that has to do with political action more broadly. But one of the things I wanted, one of the reasons I was drawn to reading, not as some sort of theorizable practice, is that it's pleasurable and it's not ascetic. And none of these thinkers that I'm interested in here thought of it as some kind of renunciatory, world relinquishing practice. It was a pleasurable practice. In cases like Hardayal and Bhagat Singh, this was a chance for comrades to read together. Gandhi thought of reading as these kind of, Isabel Hoffman has written beautifully about this kind of spreading circle of concentrics, this spreading notion of concentric circles that where you kind of memorize and recite to friends various portions of Hind Swaraj and organize communities around that. And so reading, on one hand, I mean, so the reading has been kind of, and Gloria Fisk has written about this really nicely, rendered a kind of piously aesthetic practice, and anti-colonialism too has been rendered this kind of a renunciatory aesthetic practice. And to me, neither one of them need to be, right? And it's precisely about the pleasures of reading, the pleasures of thinking anti-colonialism with your comrades in the present, rather than on behalf of some future world which will exist well beyond our lives, that needs foregrounding, I think, in our analyses of anti-colonial thought.
Great. I think we're starting to get some questions, so I think what I'll do is I'll intersperse my own with those that are coming in. But if I could ask you one other thing that shows up in the introduction, and that I think then also recurs, is the question of liberal thought, sort of broadly construed. And one of the things you say early on is that that it would be historically inaccurate and theoretically inadequate to suggest that anti-colonial thought was for or against liberalism. And in fact, you want to suggest that anti-colonial thought posited liberalism as a still open question. And obviously, the question of liberal thought will kind of differ from chapter to chapter depending on who you're focusing on. But I wonder if you could say, in a more general sense, more about this conclusion you arrive at, or this sort of this issue that you identify early on.
I mean, liberalism has what is the best way of putting this? The discussions of liberalism and empire have been the bread and butter of post-colonial studies, much like studies of nationalism. I feel like those are the two things that we tend to do very well. And I think it's too simple a story to tell about liberalism's allegiances with empire, though that story is present. Nor is it possible to tell a story where liberalism is somehow kind of utopian and anti-colonial at the same time. I think, and especially I think in the 1920s and 1930s, the thinkers who are kind of inheriting the 19th century liberal tradition are trying to still figure out what to do with it and how to make it either useful or, in my formulation, impossible, right? So so for someone like Ambedkar, right, it seems to be that liberalism, the notion of contaminability and touch and untouchability, right, relies on on liberal individual bodies, right? And so Ambedkar's way of thinking around this would be, what would it mean to create a subject so porous as to be illiberal, right? On some other, a lot of Hardayal's turn to liberalism in some kind of bizarre way is an attempt to kind of render liberalism unrecognizable to itself, right? So that the future world, which may or may not be liberal, looks back on our liberal actions in the present with curiosity and and befuddlement. And so I mean, I think liberalism was very much a question for grabs. And I think this was a moment where it was possible to play around with what liberalism might mean or could be, and what it could render impossible or possible.
Great. So I'm going to read a question that is in the chat and then get to some others as well. Could you say something about the wretched in the book's title? What makes these disparate figures wretched, or producing a world literature for the wretched of the earth? And there's a bit more to that. What do you make of Ashish Nandi's argument that Gandhi was precisely not a masculinist figure?
So there's a lot of really important questions packed into these questions. And I'm going to not do a great job answering them all completely, but I mean the sense, right? I mean the wretched of the earth as a kind of obvious citation of Fanon is the idea which he presents at the conclusion of the book, which is that the wretched of the earth are the people who respond to the call of we comrades, right? So it's not a necessarily descriptive claim, but it's a kind of it's an open invitational claim. Obviously, it has. I mean, it emerges from colonial violence, and it bears the weight of the history of colonial violence. But the wretched of the earth, right, at the end of the day, and in the conclusion, ultimately the comrades that Fanon heralds to create, with him, and to endeavor to create with him a new man, right? And it's that it's that collectivity, that political community, which I think then is then responsible for rethinking what a world literature for that new world would be. It's true that Gandhi, I think, is an especially good case of someone who was unable to theorize from lived subordination. That Savannah and caste politics play a huge role in differentiating these four thinkers, and also differentiating Fanon and Auerbach. They have. There's many things that they do not share in common, and there are many, and one of the kind of really astounding things about Gandhi and Ambedkar's career across the 1930s and 40s was how wildly they disagreed, and how astounding those disagreements, or how productive those disagreements ended up being for the history of anti-caste politics and Gandhian politics. So I mean, I don't mean to suggest that all of the figures in the book are somehow equal. They not without their own problems, and not without participating. They're very much a part of the participating in other forms of colonial, post-colonial injustices and hierarchies. The argument about Gandhi's masculinity, femininity is still, I think, I appreciate Nandi's analysis here. I think I still think that there's the kind of heroism of Gandhi's asceticism, Gandhi's fasting. These are daring things that Gandhi could do. Might not render him necessarily kind of straightforwardly masculine, but render him a national hero, a founding father, and all of the ways that Gandhi's still talked about in South Asia, in India particularly, have nevertheless retained him as this kind of retained certain aspects of Gandhi as properly masculine, as properly political, and often, despite Gandhi's own occasional claims that he's a woman, or that he is somehow not to be taken seriously as a man, and so there's a complicated kind of trajectory of gender there too, but yeah.
Great. We have a couple of people who have questions, and I'm going to let them ask them. So ARAO, please unmute.
Yes, hi. This is Anu Rao. Daniel, I had a sort of elaborate question. I'm sorry, I didn't think that I could write it down. So Daniel, I think the argument that you're making for a kind of promiscuity of thought in this period is welcome, and I think very important. But I think I want to go back and ask you about this point that you made about the kind of coeval nature of the Judenfrage, anti-colonial thought, Black thought, right? This is an argument that I think many people have made. But I would like to actually ask, what is the question of the question here? Because the Jewish question is posed, around a particular kind of impossibility, right? The caste question is posed around a particular kind of impossibility. The question of revolutionary praxis for someone like Bhagat Singh, given his youth and given the nature of his engagement with that, so Bhagat Singh and Hardayal is sort of two ends of that. I think the question means something else. So I want to kind of ask you how you would think the question, its impossibility, as it were, in each of these contexts. It seems good to think them across each other, but I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about the specific ways in which they encounter resistance, the specific ways in which they produce forms of unknowability, and so on and so forth, right? And I think this also, and sort of associated with that, is your debate with I think liberal thought, and I'd like to just ask you to say a little bit more about the nature of sort of both colonial liberalism and how you think the arc of a kind of Gandhi, Bhagat Singh, Ambedkar actually allows us to rethink the political. Such an important category, of course, for anti-colonial thinking, even if it's unavailable and or ultimately caught up in a sense of both kind of enormous failure, but of tragedy, right, in the way that David Scott talks about it. But the political as such is occupying a certain kind of ground of being and doing and knowing. So just want to hear you, say a little bit more about this.
I mean, this is a conversation I would love to have endlessly. I have a few notes off the cuff, but I'm not going to be able to answer the question as beautifully as you put it. So I think so one thing that I think this kind of triangulation of anti-colonialism, the Jewish question, and Black radical thought. One way of triangulating that is precisely that they were all theorizing the impossibility of their projects, right, in the present, right, while nevertheless demanding that one act on behalf of a world that we won't live to see. And the Jewish question, I mean, by Jewish question, I think this is this kind of shorthand, right? To me, it's more in line with the kind of radical Jewish ethics that emerges after World War II, between Levinas or minimum moralia, of how one recuperates a damaged life. I'm also indebted to Juliet Hooker, who is thinking about radical Black thought as a form of fugitivity, and anti-colonialism as, as an attempt to stay out of the bureaucratic surveillance records of the British Raj, right? So all of these ways of thinking were trying to reimagine a life that had to be lived differently for one's own survival, and to scale that up is an impossibility and yet a necessity. The second thing, kind of briefly, that I think you identified really quite well, really nicely, was that the relationship between anti-colonialism and the political is one that I think has been reduced far too simply to a kind of an issue of pragmatics, an issue of a kind of guideline playbook. First we'll throw these bombs, then we will demand these things. This was the kind of Congress Party model of anti-colonial politics, in very, very, very different ways. Gandhi, Ambedkar, Bhagat Singh, and Lala Hardayal were thinking about politics that exceeded the realm of the thinkably political. And this is what is so confusing about Hardayal, is that he, halfway through his life, drops everything about his mutinous career and becomes a scholar of Buddhism and of ethical self-care, what is so kind of frustrating about Gandhi is that he's always somehow not political enough, and yet is always a kind of political alibi for the Congress Party. And so, I mean, there are a number of different ways that all of these kind of political thinkers are thinking somehow less than the political and greater than the political. And one way of putting that might be liberalism. I'm not quite convinced of that, but I mean, I think liberalism might name one form of how to kind of one form of how one gets stuck in thinking the political as as in a certain kind of properly political framework that none of these thinkers participated in.
Great. And I know, Robert, you had a question, and feel free.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Daniel. I haven't had a chance to read either your book or your introduction yet, so this is what I'm asking is really more for information, because I haven't had a chance to get my head around what you're saying. So it's really just from things that you've been saying. And I suppose I've got two questions really. One is, I don't understand the distinction you're making between Black radical thought and anti-colonialism, because I mean, what were George Padmore, Frantz Fanon, Steve Biko? They weren't both Black and anti-colonial. So, or do you just mean, when you say Black radical thought, do you mean US Black radical thought? But even there, the imbrications of anti-colonialism and US Black radicalism were already so interlinked and inspirational for anti-colonial thinkers that I'm a bit puzzled by that separation there. The other question I had was I mean, it really comes again from your title, linking Fanon and Auerbach. Or certainly, obviously, Fanon and Gandhi were looking at kind of dialectical opposite, in simplistic terms there. But that also seems to me, in some degree, the case for Fanon and Auerbach, which it's a very interesting conjunction to think about. When you talk about anti-colonial philology, which you mentioned, I think, at the beginning of what you were saying, well, first of all, I mean, Auerbach came from the Western philological tradition, which itself was seen by others who are working in other philological traditions in the Soviet Union in particular, for example, as imperialists. So in what sense is that tradition anti-colonial? Or were you linking it, because I haven't read your book, I don't know, with Said and his late emphasis on philology, where he arguably does bring the two together. So I'd just be interested to hear a bit more about that. And also that, I mean, Auerbach, if you think of mimesis, arguably what he was trying to do was actually to totalize. I mean, he's trying to kind of recreate this European spirit, as Schmidt likes to call it, in the same period, that's been kind of dismembered by fascism. He's trying to sort of put it all together again by writing a book that brings all these European texts together. So maybe you could say a bit more about the idea that he's actually emphasizing heterogeneity. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I fully, I really appreciate the reminder that anti-colonialism and Black radical thought are not separate bodies of thought. In fact, go hand in hand throughout most of the 20th century. I mean, which is also a reminder that most post-war European Jewish thought and Black radical thought and anti-colonialism were often sitting at the same cafe in Paris. So I'm thinking about a lot of Iranian revolutionary thinkers, a lot of French anti-imperial thinkers, and Levinas and that crowd, right? I mean, that was already a shared conversation, and so to on one hand, to triangulate it would be to say, another way of saying to triangulate it would be to say to bring those conversations to foreground the way they have always been a shared conversation, especially in the 1940s and 50s. A question about philology is that one. There's a couple of ways around this. One is that philology becomes a method that anti-colonial thinkers take up to rethink nationalism on one hand, the kind of Hegelian spirit, Geist of language and so on. But also, especially in the case of Ambedkar, someone who kind of really pushes philology on its own terms. William Jones and the Manusmriti and various British East India Company sponsored translations of Arabic and Farsi and Sanskrit texts. Ambedkar is someone who uses philology in its own terms to reveal the incoherence of a project of mastery on the basis of philological understanding. And so, and Gandhi does too in his own way. Gandhi's reinvention of Sanskrit and Gujarati and English and these kind of made up words that do a lot of work for him and define nothing but define a lot at the same time. It seems to me that a lot of these thinkers are playing with a philological tradition in order to kind of undermine its imperial history. And as and you're completely correct at that. I mean, I think the full inheritor of this kind of the twin trajectories of anti-colonialism and philology then become Edward Said. I see someone who's actually kind of bringing those two lines of thought back together in the early the late 90s, early noughts. As for, I mean, there's tons. There's so much drama that surrounds Auerbach's mimesis that I would love to talk to you about it elsewhere, but I think kind of briefly, I mean, it's to me the question of method is what is so important about mimesis, and it's that it's fragmentary and foregrounds the moments of heterogeneity against the homogeneity of a text, against the homogeneity of a literary movement. And it's this notion that you could simply drop into a text, cut out some paragraph or two to celebrate that the bizarre anomaly of that paragraph. And so on one hand, yes, it is a study of the representation of reality in all of Western literature. On the other hand, it's a kind of arbitrary collection of a little bit more than 20 books, and even then, it's a little like maybe 40 paragraphs from those books, and it kind of ends abruptly with the kind of realization that it's a perpetually an unfinishable project, and written for friends who cannot be known in some literal sense. They might, without making too much of the drama of Auerbach in Istanbul, he's writing for friends who he does not know are alive and dead in Germany, but he has he needs to reach a conclusion to mimesis before fascism will reach its. And so I mean, this fragmentary celebration of heterogeneity, a kind of collaging in an emergency, and also the kind of the necessary incompleteness and the foregrounding the necessary incompleteness of that task and of the critic's task more broadly seems to me to be really what draws the kind of political thrust of mimesis.
Okay, thanks. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. So I think I'm gonna invite you to put in more questions in the chat or just speak them in to the call. But I know that Daniel wanted to spend a couple of minutes on the image on the cover. So and I think that there's a previous link with the image, but I'm also going to give you the link for the press site, which has the cover, for those of you who want to call it up. But could you just say a few words about that, Daniel?
Yes, I mean, so I will hope you see a better version on the press's website. The photographer is Gori Gill. She's a friend of mine and also a brilliant photographer who works in portraiture in India, and various projects of hers have about collaborating with people to stage their own portraits. This particular project, which is ongoing, I think it was recently at the MoMA in pre-COVID days, and I think will be coming out as a book next year. Is a kind of 15-year project that she's had with a Maharashtrian scheduled castes community who make masks for religious festivals. And she convinced them to make masks for everyday objects that would be encountered. And then in collaboration with her to then arrange a portrait of those villagers wearing the masks they designed and of their choice. To me, all of the entire collection of these images are astounding and beautiful and breathtaking and uncanny. This particular one stood out to me precisely because it seems to capture everything in one photograph. The unknowability of the teacher's face, the kind of anti-colonialism in the posters behind her, including Bhagat Singh, and this commitment to reading, which behind the mask is nevertheless present, right? So there's a kind of an unknowing, an unknowability, and a demand for unrecognizability, while also still facing the camera and arranging for the camera to get to know you. And so this image really I felt kind of captured in a beautiful way some of the themes of the book. And Gary and I talked quite a bit about this because we wanted it to be a good match and a responsible use of the images. And I'm also grateful to Forum for arranging it to be on the cover. So it's a breathtaking image, and I think it really captures, and somehow it's one of those images that actually speaks alongside the text. I hope that Goy will allow me to say that in ways that I think make it for a really interesting conversation. If you can see the full series is called Acts of Appearance. Began in earnest in 2015, and the full range of the images and the photographs are phenomenal and really amazing.
Fordham Press actually sent along a discount for the book, which I'm going to post while I pose my next question for Daniel. And maybe I could just have you spend a few more minutes on Ambedkar, Daniel, in part because not only is there a great deal of work around him today, but he's also to some extent kind of featuring in more kind of in larger public discussions. For instance, he shows up in Isabel Wilkerson's cast, where she describes his connection to Du Bois and what have you. He's having kind of a moment, maybe. But your take on him is actually, I think, rather different from most. And you talk about him sort of making use of the forms of sociological thought that are available to him in the early 20th century in ways that perhaps we haven't appreciated. And you later talk about his conversion to Buddhism as well, and it almost becomes kind of the closing note of the book, actually. Could you say a bit more about your work with his texts?
Yes, I mean, this chapter began in many ways as a way to continue a conversation with Anu, who has pushed me to think more seriously about Ambedkar's intellectual history and intellectual trajectory, and for whom Anu, I hope I am getting this correct. And for it's Ambedkar's project, which is is an absolute necessity, and also Ambedkar realizes the kind of impossibility of seeing it finished or accomplished in his lifetime. And it contains multiple moving parts. One is a kind of annihilation of caste. One is a security of governmental institutional assurances up until the point that caste might be annihilated. So in order to protect Dalits and scheduled and backwards caste people, and then ultimately when the state has failed Ambedkar in all sorts of ways, right? A move towards Buddhism, not as a way of leaving the fold, though it is also leaving the fold, but as in fact leaving and staying at the same time, and looking to political forms of community that the state simply cannot contain. What I wanted to do in this chapter, and I think this is also kind of the beginnings of book 2, is trace Ambedkar's indebtedness to early sociology, not because he was John Dewey's student. He was John Dewey's student. He cited John Dewey, great, fine. But what he did with John Dewey and William James and Henri Bergson's vocabulary was to push it to a limit that that I don't think that Dewey or James or Bergson could have imagined, and to take seriously the instability of early sociology, and to render that instability actually a political to render those kind of implicit promises of early sociology as viable political projects. So this chapter was obviously written before COVID, but the term that I found so kind of moving in Ambedkar's work is a term called endosmosis, which is the process which John Dewey uses, but which also Henri Bergson uses as a way of trying to think about shared consciousness over duration. But it's a kind of 19th century biological term where two cells semi-permeate each other. And that is the extent of my biological science knowledge. But for Ambedkar to have taken this kind of curious, bizarre term from Henri Bergson, so from vitalism to kind of early experimental sociology, and then to suggest that it's endosmosis that is the semi-permeability of human, that then would become the semi-permeability of human subjectivity as the basis for eradicating caste, annihilating caste, then is much bigger than I think just saying that he's a Dewey student. What he's doing with Dewey's and in Bergson's and James's writings is to render them actually quite useful for an anti-caste politics. And in that chapter, that chapter goes both ways. So on one hand, it's the ascendancy of sociology in the early teens, which Ambedkar uses to his advantage to theorize the annihilation of caste. And on the other hand, it's the decline of philology in the teens, which Ambedkar picks up on to critique William Jones and the Manusmriti and the Puranas and all of these texts, which have been the alleged proof of Brahminical superiority. So Ambedkar in some ways is kind of captures this kind of nexus where philology is on the decline, sociology is ascending, and he brings the force of both for this kind of anti-authoritarian, anti-casteist critique that renders Brahminical supremacy impossible, and also renders caste impossible by way of contagion and contaminability and contaminated contaminability. So the end result would be then, if we are all endosmotic subjects, there would not be a question of touching strangers. There would not be a question of touchability or untouchability. That we would always sort of have an openness that would render caste impossible to think.
I have a question. Hi, was there another title for this book in another region of the world. I thought I heard that in the beginning, or maybe I could be wrong, and I might have a follow-up question if so.
You're completely correct. So this is the World Literature for the Wretched of the Earth is the Fordham title, and it was published simultaneously, well, more or less, in South Asia by Orient Black Swan under a different title, which is Impossible and Necessary. It is the same text, and both titles seem to me to be getting at a central concern of the book, no matter what the cover is. Either the project of anti-colonialism is impossible and also necessary, or simultaneously, the project of world literature for the wretched of the earth is that shared genealogy of philological critique and comparativism and anti-colonial thinking.
Yeah, I find that super interesting, just in a sort of, as a comparative literature student, in a way, like, revolving around comparative literature. I find it super interesting just to think about the name changes. And I'm also wondering, do you totally mean that in the English language, like, or is that a translation? It's the English language, right? And just so.
Yeah, no, it is yet to be translated outside of English. But yeah, so it's a South Asian publisher, right, Black Swan, and it's published in English with a preface by. I'm incredibly honored. It has a preface by Pratima Banerjee, who kind of says in 4 pages what it took me 190 pages to say, much more expansively. But I mean, that's the only difference.
Got it. It sounds super interesting. I'm just, wondering, do you think anything about, changing titles, or, I mean, just, altering the titles of books a little bit, or, maybe altering certain words or phrases for different parts of the world, or different cultures, or, periods of existence, ways of being, or whatnot. I just find it super interesting to ask that question.
No, I think up until you asked that question, I thought of it merely as this kind of practical paperwork issue. But I mean, it reminds me, of one of the kind of very popular practices of anti-colonialism, from Gandhi to Hardayal to Bhagat Singh, which was the culture of reprinting by changing the title. So such that in a very, very kind of curious moment of print culture, Bhagat Singh appears as the author of a text in 1939, which is 8 years after he's died. But the text is a text that Hardayal had written in 1911, but the name had been changed, the author had been changed, and it had been reprinted by the Ghadar Party in Punjabi. So it was also originally written in English and Hindi, and then it was translated into Punjabi, and then published as Bhagat Singh's text. And so, I mean, this is a much more provocative kind of scene than my book in its various iterations. But I think it really speaks to the kind of promiscuity of political thought, and also, I mean, the necessity of trying everything, of reprinting everything, of reminding every, of using print culture to the benefit of every possible political use that could be imagined, even if it meant changing authors and titles and languages. So I thank you for making me think about that differently.
And there's a question from Michael about world literature and different visions of it that emerge in different places, in Casanova, in Amrosh. I don't know, do you want to just quickly ask your question, Michael?
Yeah, sure. I was just curious. I mean, I thought one of the major sort of interventions in the introduction, from what I read of the book, is how it sort of tries to sort of move the conversation about world literature away from a kind of definitional practice or sort of canon forming activity. And it's related to your sort of polemic against, sort of expertise and mastery. So I was just curious if you could speak a little bit more about what are the benefits of thinking world literature, not as a canon, but as a kind of interminable practice of self-effacement. And how does it sort of differ from, sort of Damroche's definition, any work that gains in translation can count as world literature, or Pascal Casanova, who sort of sees works of world literature as these sort of universal texts that achieve some kind of transcendent, sort of universality via consecration in France. So yeah, I just was hoping you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. What I decided to do fairly early on was to take a step back from using definitions of world literature, and instead trying to figure out what anti-colonial thinkers meant when they used the phrase world literature, which they use all the time. And world literature was a way for them to talk about the circulation of print material from the Irish Republican Army to the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, and that included, world literature in that moment included how to build manuals on how to build bombs, Giuseppe Mazzini's Duties of Man, translated to such that Gandhi could find as much use as Mussolini. And also, I think the kind of example that always comes to mind is that is Gandhi's the most kind of popular this kind of most popular text in the 1920s was Gandhi's totally wild interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita, which he kind of re-put into world literature by way of a completely idiosyncratic analysis of it. Such that a warrior going into battle is the proof of the need for nonviolence, and so these tracking world literature not from the vantage point of world literary theorists today, but from finding that term used over and over again in anti-colonial writing, it was what made me want to think about how one imagines the post-colonial world, and then how one imagined necessarily that literature must be a part of that post-colonial world, and then to go to the next step, which is to figure out what that literature might look like, could be, or so on. The term that I'm drawn to, indebted to as well, is B. Venkatmani's notion of bibliomigrancy, which is in some ways a kind of way of taking Casanova and Damroche and pushing them in a different direction to just think about the mere circulation of texts, without kind of any restriction, but the idea that texts circulate, that's what they do, and from that we might arrive at world literature, but for me the kind of primary focus was to track namely two terms in anti-colonial thought: reading, and what kind of circulated, what ideas circulated around the phrase, the notion of reading in each of these thinkers, and world literature, and what these anti-colonial thinkers thought world literature was, is, or could be, and that was my approach.
Speaking of the circulation of text, I wanted to ask you about Hardayal's Hints for Self-Culture, because that's actually the text I really wanted to kind of get a hold of after reading your book, for a number of reasons. One is just the interesting ways in which it's a combination of different sort of traditions, but also because I know that he meets and intersects for a time with the American writer Alain Locke at Oxford, who himself will often sort of lecture and talk about self-culture as a term when teaching at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and it becomes a kind of keyword in his own thinking. So where and when did Hints for Self-Culture circulate, and how did it become so central to your reading of Hardayal?
I should I should tell you up front that it is not a particularly beloved book in Hardayal's corpus. It's not his most vibrantly written book. I mean, there's a full chapter on how many times to chew food, depending on what type of food it is, and it is a long book about very tedious facts, and it participates. I mean, it kind of very it's very self-aware and participating in a number of different trajectories. One is 19th century liberal philosophy from John Stuart Blackie, who has this kind of notions of self-culture that, for personal embetterment, but also Giuseppe Mazzini's Duties of Man, which is about the duties of, which is about the kind of formation of self-culture in order to produce Italy, in some kind of fascist nationalist sense, quite explicitly, and so. And it was written in 1934, and certainly by 1934, none of the texts that it's claiming to be indebted to are at all interesting anymore. I mean, and the kind of most indebted it says it is, or claims to be most indebted to Herbert Spencer, who by 1934 was a complete joke of 19th century optimistic liberalism, right? And Lamarckism and all of these things. And so it is a really curious book because it doesn't fit in any kind of time, right? So it's a book written in the interwar period, which has the kind of structure of a 19th century self-help guide, but which is in the service not of a nation state, but of a 3 generations from now world state, which whose politics is friendship, and the citizens of that world state will have only realized what has occurred when they look back upon us having chewed our food 32 times properly in the present, right? And so the book to me is a mess of a book, precisely because it's a text out of joint with its time. It's a text out of joint with any time, and yet it is it's also deeply invested in reading practices that are also out of time. The idea that you would part of, in addition to chewing your food 32 times per bite, there's this notion that you were to read books that are out of their own time, that didn't make sense when they were written, and because those will be the books that 3 generations from now will remain out of sync with their own time. And so it's a bizarre book. Kind of anecdotally, when I talk about the book in Delhi, everyone has an uncle who has a copy. It was it was for sale on the street. I found my copy on the street in Delhi, but it's a book that is not particularly known for its radical politics. And I think, especially for someone like Hardayal, who is so well known for actively advocating armed mutiny against the British Raj, to then take 20 years later to write a book that is a reflection on reading and friendship. These two parts of Hardayal have been so separated out. The project of that chapter was to bring those 2 parts back together and to think what revolution looks like if it also includes reading, chewing food, and friendship.
Thank you so much for that, Daniel. I think we have time for maybe just a couple of more questions if anybody wants to come in or offer it in the chat. Feel free. Something I wanted to ask is about this encounter between Gandhi and Margaret Sanger, the American reproductive rights activist, which I think has been written about in the past, but I think that your take on it is actually very original. And you essentially have him saying in that kind of conflictual encounter, please allow me to be wrong. I can't remember if those are his exact words or if that's sort of your ultimate sort of take on what he's asking her to do. But if you could just, I don't know, briefly sort of reprise that moment for us, and sort of and what you have to say about it.
So there are two debates that happened back to back in 1934 to 1935 that Gandhi insists on losing. And so one is a debate with Margaret Sanger about birth control in India, and the other is with Reproductive about the cause of earthquakes. And I'll give you the cause of earthquakes for Tagore was plate tectonics, but for Gandhi was caste. And Gandhi opened that debate with Tagore by saying, "I am completely wrong about this. Please let me lose this debate. Please be foolish with me enough, but be foolish with me long enough to think about what it would mean that caste was the cause of earthquakes." And Tagore has zero patience with this. Tagore says, yes, caste is obviously a problem, but it does not cause earthquakes. Margaret Sanger had come to Delhi in December 1934 to advocate for Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, and at that time also a major advocate for eugenics, had come to Delhi to suggest, to kind of promote birth control, and also kind of, and also eugenics in South Asia, and in that debate, so that debate took place. The debate that they staged, which was sponsored by Sarojini Naidu, was arranged very beautifully. It took place over the course of 2 days, and the first thing that Gandhi says after, so Margaret Sanger opens with this kind of astounding call for women to be able to choose, to have power over their reproductive rights, and Gandhi says a few things. One, he says, "What I'm about to say is going to be incorrect. I don't know anything about birth control. I don't know anything about what you want me to do. Two, I've spoken to people who agree with you, and they are smarter than me, and so it's best that you probably rely on them. Three, this is the kind of most shocking, most uncomfortable part of this discussion. Three, I have not been able to control my own sexual desires towards my wife at her expense, and therefore there's not even a way in which I am a redeemable figure for talking about reproductive rights for women." And so what Gandhi sets up, I mean, as you might imagine, Margaret Sanger is incredibly frustrated and continues to push the debate over the next 2 days. But what Gandhi has set up quite well is this sense that there is that Margaret Sanger is correct, that women should have reproductive rights and have control of their sexual health, and that Gandhi is simply there to be given up as foolish. And Gandhi's line to be given up as foolish. Gandhi's line is to let me lose this debate. Appears in the earthquake debate, appears in the Margaret Sanger debate, but is actually you can also find traces of it in his autobiography during his time in London, where when forced to defend his vow of vegetarianism, he says, "I can't debate this. I've lost this debate. Please give me up as foolish. I have no idea why I'm vegetarian. I have no good reason for it whatsoever. Please allow me to be foolish. Please allow me to be wrong. Please allow me to lose this debate." And this, I mean, it's one way of reading this would be to say that it's a kind of cheeky way for Gandhi to get out of arguing. I think that's a short-sighted way of seeing what Gandhi's up to. I think if we were to take Gandhi at his word, we see something more interesting formulation, which is Gandhi asking you to give him up as foolish is the creation of two renunciants on the same page. So if I am asking you to give, I am unable to give myself up. Please give me up as foolish. You renunciate me. I renunciated myself, and therefore we have this kind of endless kind of renunciation ad infinitum, but which is egalitarian in its vision. It's a kind of race towards I mean, it's the other phrase that Gandhi is famous for is it's the desire to be reduced to nothing, right? But it's that this kind of request for shared renunciation, in the form of lost debates or in the form of being given up as foolish, that I think really drives a Gandhian egalitarian project.
That's so great and so helpful. Thank you, Daniel. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yeah, Raj.
Thanks, Daniel. I will just, it's a far more general question, but actually I have two questions. Let me just ask both. One is, you make this distinction between, or you say we have to read the consequences and the inconsequences together in the introduction, which means that they throw bombs, they make demands, but also there's a certain inconsequential aspect. Can you just say something more about how we read this both together? Because of course, there's not in a hagiographic sense, but in a political sense, these are political actions in the public sphere with specific demands, as you say. So how do we read them both together? That's one. And the second is, I mean, when you see your project, but a lot of other projects in the past 15, 20 years on what's being called Indian political theory of sorts, right? And how do you see it as coming after, say, in the 70s, you have Rajni Kothari doing certain kind of political science and democracy and election studies or Marxism, and the 90s, you had a certain subaltern studies. So, but you just draw this genealogy. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I mean, the best way for me to explain, and this is taking us a bit off, allow me the division. The best way for me to explain how I think the relationship between consequence and inconsequence as necessarily always together, especially for South Asian anti-colonial thought, is a completely different context whatsoever at all, and it is the late 80s, early 90s AIDS, HIV activism, which was making demands to the CDC, to the US government for drugs for antiretrovirals, right? And they were drugs that these people who were staging die-ins or various other actions knew that there was a very, very, very good chance they would be dead before those drugs arrived. So again, it's a situation where you are demanding a world that you won't live to see, and you're acting on behalf of it. And those demands are vocal, they're open, they're in no uncertain terms directed at the state. That is certainly what Gandhi and Bhagat Singh and Hardale and Baker were doing. At the same time, I'm working on a book about HIV/AIDS activism in the 80s and 90s, and as I interview people who were kind of active in ACT UP or some other organizations, what I find myself really moved by are these stories of people who take care of other people's cats when they go to the hospital, or people who take care of other people's flowers when they go to the hospital, knowing that those people probably won't come back from the hospital to their cats and flowers, right? And this is such an inconsequential act, these cats, these flowers, and they run alongside the very, very consequential demands that ACT UP is making in the street. And for people, I think, whose lives have been deemed irrelevant, to think it's absolutely necessary to think the consequential and the inconsequential together, right? How do you continue to make demands on the state for some form of justice? And how do you enact a certain form of fleeting justice among your friends in the present, well in advance of the state hearing you or recognizing you as worth protecting? And so that to me is how I don't think consequence and inconsequence are paradoxical, but in the really vibrant strains of 20th century activism have worked alongside each other for a lot of different communities. Your second question is a question that I should have a clear answer to, but it's a question that has actually made me want to think a bit more about it. And each time I get asked this question, I think it needs a richer and richer answer. I mean, there are a few ways of kind of arriving at some half answer, which is to say that I think that the changes in the movement from in the wake of subaltern studies was towards a certain type of global intellectual history or intellectual history for South Asia, which was about recuperating not the great men of South Asian history, but doing something else. I mean, with the intellectual formation of what then would become post-colonial India. So Anu Rao thinking about Ambedkar, Shruti Kapila thinking about Gandhi and B.D. Savarkar, and Pratibha Banerjee's most recent book, which is is just a brilliant reconceptualization of the categories of Indian political philosophy altogether. All of these, this seems to have emerged in the wake of subaltern studies, not as a way of kind of returning to the great thinkers of the Indian intellectual tradition, but rather as a way of kind of contextualizing South Asian political thought in a global history of ideas. I'm incredibly indebted to a lot of this work. Ajay Skaria's work has been outstanding and thinking about kind of situating Gandhi as a philosopher. For example, I mean, one thing that I think I want to move away from is the idea that in order for us to take Gandhi seriously, in order to take Ambedkar seriously, we have to find their European equivalent. Gandhi has to be sort of like Arendt. We have to find the anti-colonial Derrida. And I mean, Spivak kind of famously reminded us that Derrida is the anti-colonial Derrida. But it seems to me that the thing that we have to take seriously is that Gandhi was not Arendt, not Adorno. He was writing in jail. Bhagat Singh was writing while in hiding. Ambedkar was writing on the road and in the midst of of so many different political projects he was actively involved in. These are thinkers whose promiscuity of thought was the necessity, came from necessity and has to be kind of resituated in that context, and so cannot simply be kind of aligned one-to-one with some contemporary that they would have had in Europe, but actually has to be thought in its own particular conjecture and on its own terms.
That's such a great place to close, I think, Daniel. Really, really great. So I want to thank everybody who joined the Zoom call today, and above all, Daniel for coming in from Basel, where I think it's getting late. It's getting a little bit late, I think. But I also wanted to say that, as I think I mentioned earlier, this is the first of several events being hosted by NYU's Comparative Literature Department. Michael, what would be the easiest way to find out about future events?
The best way to find out about the events is to go onto the department's event calendar, which I will put the link in the chat right now, so you can see all the upcoming events.
So I invite all of you to come back to join us again. I think there are at least 2 things I know about next week, and I want to once more thank Daniel for spending some time with us and telling us about his new book. Hope you all get a chance to read it.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you so much.
Good to see you. Bye.
Talk to you soon.